Okay, so here we are back again. Welcome to LIFICAST. This is episode 2, the official podcast that runs alongside the Leeds International Festival. The purpose of this podcast is to take a look at some of the big questions that the festival is asking. And today we are looking at the question, does the future have enough food? A tricky one, considering that the population globally is expected to hit 9 billion people in 30 years' time. So here to answer that question unreservedly and find a solution to it in the next half an hour, I can guarantee it, are our two guests today. It's Eddy and Will. Welcome, chaps. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good, nice to have you here for this. Eddy, just give us a full introduction, if you will.
Yeah, so I'm Eddy Lascelles. I'm the Managing Director of the Harewood Food and Drink Project. So we're based on the Harewood estate just north of Leeds. I'd like to think that we're one of the local champions of sourcing locally, sourcing seasonally. We're big advocates of plot to plate eating, field to fork eating, and 0 miles food. Something that we often try and do is make the connection, try and highlight the importance of the connection of where your food comes from. So we run all of the catering on site, and my brief to our team of chefs is to use as much produce sourced from the estate itself across all of the range of catering activity that we do.
Fantastic. Will?
Hi.
Tell us your story.
So my name's Will Campbell. I've been in hospitality about 7-8 years, and I now work at the Ox Club in Hedgerow House. I've been in the industry a while and worked my way up to sous chef there. I've worked in lots of different types of restaurants, from pubs, cafes, to the high-end Michelin star restaurants, and now I found myself at Ox Club. It's a restaurant I love. We try and champion kind of single ingredients, rare cut big steaks, cuts of meat, and just cook them properly over fire with very little else added to it.
Great. Is now a good time to say I'm a vegetarian, by the way. And you do lots of work with the Real Junk Food Project as well.
So through lockdown, I was volunteering for them at their warehouse, an incredible company. They basically intercept food from anywhere they can get hold of it, supermarkets, restaurants. I think they started fishing through bins at the beginning, and now they distribute it to whoever will take it. The CEO, Adam Smith, is a great guy, really charismatic.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. You might be wondering what our little machine is in the middle of the table. It's not for a game of bingo. This is the Leeds International Festival random question generator. So we'll get you to have a go on this throughout the course of the podcast. Just to show as well, actually, how quickly the population is growing, I've got the world population calculator here in front of me. So right now at the start of this podcast, it's currently at 7,890,391,437,840 people. So it's growing quickly. So I'm going to note down at the end how many extra people there are in the world that we have to feed. So where do we start with this? Let's start with you, Eddy. When it comes to the issues around feeding people at the moment, what do you think are the big problems that we have? What are the areas that we need to be focusing on?
I think it's such a complex, deeply rooted problem that, I think if there was a simple answer, we probably would have found it and adapted to it now. I think that I guess the good news is that I think people on the whole want to do the right thing when it comes to eating sustainably, but they just don't quite know how. And I think the how is the really complicated bit, and that's ultimately driven by the supply chain, starting with the farmer and the retailers and then ending with the consumer. So I just think it's such a wide-ranging issue to tackle, that it's something that I think small changes are what's needed across all of that supply chain to add up to something that's a much bigger impact. But it's like, it is something that's very close to my heart, and I think, in our small corner of Yorkshire, we're trying to do what we can just to show that there are ways you can do it. It just, it comes down to education ultimately and knowledge about methods and sourcing and suppliers and all that kind of thing.
So who do you think takes that responsibility though? Whose job is that, Will, to make sure people are educated? Is that up to me as a consumer to find out? Is it down to you as a cook?
I think everybody involved in this supply chain, and everybody even linked in it in some way, from the producers to the people selling the food, the people cooking the food, and even the people buying the food that are conscious of it.
And I think a lot of it is the supermarkets drive a lot of the consumer trends. And I think that the fact that it's cheaper to buy a strawberry in January from the supermarket than it is to buy a strawberry from the farmer in the field next to you when it's banging season in June highlights how big that problem is. And I think a lot of it does come down to the commodity, the cost of that product. So I think until sourcing locally is more affordable, this will always be a problem.
And why isn't it? What is that? Because the supermarkets are driving down prices as loss leaders to get people in? Is it because people like yourselves are charging too much? Local farmers know that people are maybe conscious more of the provenance of their food, so they can charge more for a side of beef.
Yeah.
What is the reason behind that?
Well, I think it's the economies of scale that the supermarkets play. If they grow in such huge mass-produced quantities, the cost per unit is that much less, whereas typically locally sourced is grown on a much smaller scale, so therefore the overhead costs are more, so the final cost is more. So I think that's the root of it, is the mass-produced farming.
When you are cooking, Will, how much are you conscious of the origins of your food and where that comes from?
For me, absolutely everything. It's every ingredient. We know where it comes from. We know the farms we use. We visit the farms often, and it's just so important to understand. And it tastes better if you
Does
know,
it definitely taste better?
If you know
this
where
is
it
something
comes
somebody
from.
will say, like it tastes better unequivocally.
It doesn't sound true, but if you know where it comes from, it definitely tastes better. I'm sure you've all grown something in the garden, and that it's just sweet. The strawberries are sweeter. It's so true.
Yeah. There seems to me, when it comes to the future of food, a couple of really big areas to take a look at, and that's the environmental impact of food, and that's the issue of food waste. So let's get into food waste, because I know that's something that you're both really passionate about. Globally, nearly 30%, almost a third of calories produced end up in the bin, just thrown away. And here, unsurprisingly, in the West, we are worst for it. What's your experience of food waste, Will, and how do we go about dealing with that issue?
For me, most of it comes from the home.
Right.
Most of my food waste. Restaurants, we try our absolute hardest to have no food waste. You try and put that waste back into the beginning and use it somewhere else in a different dish. And it's only really the food that comes back off the plate in a restaurant that we would bin. And even then, that's then sent to a recycling centre or a composting centre. So I think for me, the problem's always at home. It's doing that big shop once a week and then not eating the food. Yeah. And it's so easy to throw it away and you think nothing of it.
Yeah. There is also an issue though with big business throwing away a lot of food, isn't there? And you probably haven't got experience of this because we were able to manage the land much better. But when you look at the big supermarkets, we see the binfuls of fresh food that's thrown away. Some of it does end up at the likes of the Real Junk Food Project, but a lot of it is just binned for various reasons. Yeah. How do we go about stopping that? That's an easy one for you, by the way.
I think people just need to buy what they need to eat, and I think people, I think as human beings we just consume so much. We're so greedy, and I think that it's just, I think it's important that people just eat what they need. Yeah. And I just think it's that kind of fundamental mind shift to focus more on that as opposed to just buying all this food that sits in the fridge and ends up in the bin.
Here's a stat for you, because I like my stats, as you might realise. So food here in the West is much more of a commodity that we don't care about. So 95 to 115 kilos per person is thrown away here each year. Compare that to sub-Saharan Africa, where they throw away 6 to 11 kilos a year per person. So does that come from greed here, do you think? And just the fact we take it for granted? Yeah. And do we maybe need to change that mindset?
I think it's just so easy here to buy food. There's rarely a shortage, and food, in certain in certain places is literally a matter of life and death, whereas for us it's just easily available at all times. And I think if we were to go back 100 years or so, if you look at the seasonality of food, you get a glut of something and you've got all these techniques to preserve it, you pickle it, you ferment it, you cure it, dry age it, whatever it might be. That's to get you through those, the winter months when there's nothing else available. So you literally don't waste anything, even if it's something that wouldn't, like a cauliflower. A lot of people throw away the leaves, but actually the leaves are...
Make a great kimchi.
Yeah.
Do they? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best bits. So it's, again, I think it's just the availability of it makes it so disposable and so easy to waste.
Yeah.
Whereas in previous times or in sub-Saharan Africa, that probably isn't the case.
Do you notice I guess it's different in a restaurant because people aren't going to go out and just leave food as much.
No, yeah.
Anyway. But in your experience of being a chef over many years, do you think that we do appreciate food enough?
I think we do, but I don't know the understanding of where it's come from in the chain.
Yeah.
And the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes to produce this food, to store it, to package it, to distribute it, and then to cook it.
How much skill does it take to be able to, and maybe this is the root cause of the problem, is that we don't have the skills to cook properly. How much skill does it take to be able to work with leftovers, for instance?
I think it's just having fun and experimenting. It's cooking, to me, is easy.
Yeah.
It just is natural. You just most things you can eat raw. You don't have to do much.
Should add a health warning to that. Like chicken, can we do chicken?
Yeah.
Can you eat chicken raw?
No, but if a chicken has been raised, if a chicken's been raised really well,
they do in parts of Japan, don't
they?
they?
Do they?
Yeah. It's
Really?
only the bacterias on the food that would make you ill. The actual meat
is that a fact?
Is absolutely fine.
I had no idea about that. Chicken gazpacho or carpaccio, I should say, on Oxford menu.
In parts of Japan, there's definitely a raw.
Right.
I imagine it's followed by a lot of salt and soy to kill any bacteria that is on it.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
you can.
I just wonder if you, as an organisation, there was talk a couple of years ago of companies having to report the amount of food they bin, and maybe that would then lead to more accountability. By law, you would have to say we've thrown away X amount of kilos this week. If that is something that would challenge businesses in particular to try and do something about this. And maybe if you were then taxed on the kilo of food that you threw away, if that would incentivise you more to use it. Yeah. Would that work?
I think that, for any restaurant, I'm sure you'll agree, Will, wastage is one of the biggest costs. So that, there's already a very kind of, there's a very important interest for the business to make sure that's kept to a minimum. I'd like to think that we're pretty good at that, and I'm sure you guys are as well. I think it's a really good point, but I think to punish that would be, I think hospitality's got so many challenges as it is. I think to punish that would be a bit mean.
Yeah. Could you see restaurants paying per kilo of food?
It would be very hard to do. It would be. But then maybe the larger restaurants that probably waste more would pay the higher, and because we don't waste too much at all, and I'm sure similarly over there's very little waste. So
let's jump into the first question from the random question generator. Would you want to go first, Eddy?
Yeah.
Have you played bingo before?
Not for a while.
It's good technique though. Oh, you've done that the wrong way, haven't you? But that's all right. You can. What number's that? That's fine.
It is B9.
B number 9. Oh, interesting. So this leads us into our next topic of conversation. Should we make it the law to only eat meat 5 days a week? And the context of this question is the fact that meat is a heavy polluter. Agriculture makes up about 8 to 10% of the world's CO2 emissions. The amount that beef, for instance, or animals contribute to that is a huge portion. A kilo of beef emits 60 kilos of greenhouse gases, whereas peas emit 1 kilo of greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
So it's a hugely polluting animal in terms of rearing it.
Yeah.
A lot of talk, obviously, for quite a while now about veganism and meat-free Mondays and all that kind of stuff, or meat-free Friday. So let's make it the law and say you can only eat meat 5 days a week. What do you reckon? That solve our problems?
I think that, I mean, I'm sure it would make a difference, but I think there's a more important point, which is that eating meat can be done with a clear conscience, provided that it's sourced properly. Much of the problem is around the kind of high intensity farmed meat products, which without, incredibly detrimental to the soil, the waters, the environment as a whole. So I think focusing on meat production that is low intensity and regenerative to the environment is the way to go. That's the way we do things at Harewood. I think focusing on meats that offer a more kind of sustainable approach, something like venison, for example, which is technically it's game, it's a wild meat. It's a healthy alternative to beef. It's cheaper. It's typically low intensity farmed. It's sustainable. Actually the deer live quite kind of symbiotically with the land that they live on. So it creates more of a kind of enhanced habitat there. So I think that, if you were to categorize it as mass-produced beef, yes, but I think to kind of label all meat as the same would be only partly kind of solving that problem. Other game like rabbit, for example, which is so abundant, so lean, it's delicious, but very few people eat it.
Yeah.
And it's not really available. You'd never see it in a supermarket, rarely see it in a butcher's. But it is so abundant, and it's an alternative to other mass-produced meats.
Well, I'm aware that you work in a meaty restaurant, and I don't want to get you fired, obviously, so you're never going to say we should stop eating beef or meat. But what are your thoughts on limiting the amount of meat that we eat, or maybe going vegetarian, dare I say?
think as a society, we all are a lot more conscious of it now anyway. Personally, I probably only eat meat twice a week, but I would never set that in stone. That's never written in stone. I think using a little bit of waste product from the meat, I might cook a roast dinner, and you've got the bones, you've got some stock, you've got some gravy, you've got some offcuts from it that you can make. So that way you're using, from this one cut of meat, you could eat 4 or 5 meals out of it.
Do we have to accept that we need to eat far less meat, though? Environmentally. And it seems to be happening.
But like Eddy said, it's the mass farming, the big industrial farming that is the problem here.
Eat less, but eat better.
Eat better.
Yeah. What about the impact that it has on actually just rearing it and growing it? And I'm interested from you, Eddy, in terms of the size and the space. It takes much more space to rear livestock, especially cows and sheep, than it does to grow crops.
Yeah.
And across the globe, there are far more calories that come from plant-based food, but it only takes up about 20% of the land that's used for agriculture. So if we could expand the land used for agriculture, we could massively increase the amount of calories we can produce from plant-based food. So would you consider dedicating more space to growing plant-based food and less to animals in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we've got about 600 acres that's farmed farmed arably for crops and vegetables and all that kind of stuff. Which is, you can grow quite a lot of food on that amount of land. I think that we're always looking for ways that the estate can be more sustainable and more regenerative and create more of a kind of circular economy about what's grown and how it's grown. So I think that, certainly meat, animal, livestock holding and arable farming, I think both can be regenerative. I think that if your agenda is to grow as much food as possible, which ours obviously isn't, then I'm sure that's a really valid argument. But for us, I think just having that balance is quite important.
Yeah. Come on then, Will, let's have another question from you then on our little machine. Feel free to grab it and bring it across to you. Give it a spin. Anywhere you want. I'll move these two out of the way. Go on, you've got it. There it is.
We got 2.
Number 2.
Excellent. Should we pay, you, businesses, the food industry, pay a carbon tax on food? So this is born out of the fact that last year Quorn, the soy protein brand, became the first brand to put on all their products the carbon footprint of their products. So do you think that people who maybe use too much carbon over a certain level in producing their food should be forced to pay more tax to compensate?
Again, it's on the larger companies. For the smaller companies, it wouldn't feel right. It wouldn't feel necessary. But Quorn as a company are huge now, and there's nothing wrong with sharing that data. But I don't know if a tax on it is, I think, just becoming aware and the consumer reading and learning about that more than the actual taxing of it.
Do you think we'll ever get to a point where, much like the traffic light system on food, we would see the carbon footprint to make us more conscious about our environmental impact on?
I think it would be a really big step in the right direction if that was the case. And I think that your question, it'd be nice to say the answer would be yes. I think that'd be great to be taxed on it. But obviously the implications of that on business and businesses, many of whom are finding it difficult after obviously the last 18 months. It's a tough industry at the best of times. So it's the implications of that. Ultimately, the cost would have to be passed on to you and I, the consumer. So I think it's a good idea, but does it make it unaffordable? It's a difficult one to say for sure.
The issue of affordability is an interesting one, and this is something we've touched on, is if we want our food to be more sustainable, do we have to be prepared as consumers to pay more? Because at the moment we expect really good quality stuff and we just don't want to pay much for it. And I wonder if that will ever change, or if you've noticed that changing, Will.
I think it has been creeping up over the years. We regularly meet as a restaurant and think, can we do it again? Can we keep raising prices? Are people going to start calling us out? And the gap between your cheaper restaurants and your chain restaurants, and they're getting lower and we're getting higher, you're batting against each other. And it's nerve-wracking for us to keep putting the costs up, but it's the only thing we can do. There's no way around it.
And do you put the costs up because your suppliers are putting the costs up?
Exactly. The whole system is going up. Everyone deserves more money for the work they're doing, and the margins are so small anyway. Like, nobody's walking away with money in their pockets, especially from well-raised animals, well-grown crops. It's not a very profitable business.
Do people realise they need to pay more if they want to do their bit to help and get better quality food?
I think that's a part of the problem in this country, is that eating well is something that is perceived to be for the privileged.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at other countries like, if you look at Italy or France, say, where there's, the food is such a deeply embedded part of their culture, and actually eating well is almost like it's a birthright. Everybody eats well, regardless of if you're the wealthiest or, work from a working class background. And I think that's because there's something in the supply chain in those countries that just allows everybody to afford good quality, local, seasonal produce. So I think it's a supply chain thing here, whereby again it's cheaper to buy that strawberry in January that's grown in Peru and flown over than it is to buy it from the field next door. And I don't quite get it, because that strawberry next door is probably grown naturally. You're not using pesticides and you're not shipping it miles, but it costs more.
I guess it's because we're not paying the farmer at the other end very much money.
Well, exactly.
I guess it's them that's having to suck it up, right?
Yeah.
Apparently air freight makes about 11% of the food transport emissions across our country. You think it's only really a very small amount that's thrown in, but that's flown in, but it contributes hugely to the environmental impact. And I just wonder if, again, that comes back to the consumer understanding more. Like, how much do you take it upon yourself when you're with a client or a customer or whatever to explain where the food's coming from and to tell them about the food origin?
It's a huge part of what we're about. And a big part of our brand and our tone and our message is about getting that message across. And I think it's about reinforcing why that's important to know that. It's, you know, it tends to, obviously, the environmental impact of transportation, it's the freshness, supporting local economy, it's the nutritional value that you get from something that's grown and harvested fresh versus something that was picked and shipped over how many weeks ago. So I think it's just important that people understand that. So that's a big part of our message that we try and get across as often as possible.
Yeah. How do you do it without talking down to them, though, Will? Like, how do you tell somebody about their food without preaching to them?
I mean, there's normally quite an interesting story that comes with it.
Yeah.
You know, every steak on the menu is a rare breed. It's an interesting, somebody's grown it. Quite often it's local. They might know the place. They might have been there. You know, we often get a lot of the pork from a farm near our restaurant manager's family home, and he used to walk through the fields when he was a kid. And that's a beautiful story to tell to people, and people engage with that and love it.
Yeah. Go on then, Will, give us another question from our... Or who's next? Have you had a go?
No, you go, Will.
You go on then, Will. You go.
I'll go.
Eddy, you're due one as well, aren't you?
I am.
That's 10.
10. All right, okay, this is interesting. So when was the last time you threw away or didn't eat some perfectly good food? I'll ask that to both of you. You've got to be honest about this.
Today.
Was it?
Today.
What happened?
Prepping in the kitchen.
Yeah.
You know, some things you're just tasting and it's not quite right. So in the bin, you've got to start again.
Could you have done anything with that at all? Probably not for a customer, maybe just for yourself.
Probably, yeah, exactly. That's one of the things we could probably improve. We work in Harewood House and there's loads of staff there, and I'm sure for them, but in the heat of the moment in a kitchen, you often, if it's not right, you need to start again. Time's so short. So for me, I burnt some cream and that was it. It was only a small amount.
Straight to hell for you.
Yep.
Eddy, what about you?
I was just trying to think. I mean, I've got a 1-year-old boy at home.
Oh,
and
well,
he's a bit. It's
every meal, then.
Yeah, it's a bit hit or miss. What he will and won't eat. So quite a lot of his dinner ends up in the bin.
I said to my wife only yesterday when we were talking about this topic, I was like, 25% of calories thrown away. At least 50% of those 25s are toddlers.
Yeah.
That yesterday will eat every single mouthful, and today won't eat any of it.
I know. So I cooked a gorgeous omelette for him yesterday. It didn't touch it. So that ended up in the bin, sadly.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. So where do you think we go from here? I mean, we've talked about the importance of understanding where your food comes from. We've talked about the importance of trying to not waste food. But these are conversations I feel like we've been having for a long time. And I just wonder at what point, Eddy, it does start to change, or does it just become a continual conversation?
I mean, I think it is changing for the better. I think one of the positives that's come out of the last 18 months with COVID is that I do think people buy locally more, and I think people are more connected to the grassroots of production, where a lot of farmers started doing kind of mail order meat boxes or veg boxes or whatever it might be. So I think that's a really important step in the right direction, because it's cutting a big part of that supply chain out, which is wasteful, which is wrapped in plastic, which is, you know, air miles or road miles. So I think that's a really good step forward. I mean, it is so deeply rooted that there's no quick fix. I just think it's a general awareness that people need to adapt their behaviour to be more conscious about how their food's grown and how it's consumed, to start making a bit of a difference with that. But it is, you know, I do think there's definitely more of a awareness of it and a increased appetite to change behaviours for the better.
Nice pun. Are we at a tipping point, do you think? Well, are we finally getting there, or is it just people like, I don't know, us and those that are listening to this podcast that are making the change?
Well, that's always the thing you've got to think about. I was thinking on the way here, I think talk about it daily with friends, family, but maybe it's because I'm a chef.
And they agree with you on it.
Yeah.
It's the people that don't listen or you can't reach or don't come to your restaurant that are the ones you need to try and tackle.
They're the ones.
And I just wonder, how do you get to those?
How can we get to them?
Yeah.
I mean, just keep doing what we're doing. I think is the only way we can keep pushing harder and doing more. But it definitely is on the turn, isn't it? There's definitely more and more. I'm sure the conversations are getting bigger and bigger.
I mean, I think it needs people to make statements that people pay attention to. I mean, if you look at someone like Extinction Rebellion, not necessarily saying that I'd support the way they do things, but certainly the statements that they make do get heard, and people listen to that. And I think that with this, it needs a similar kind of approach, where just a statement that really captures people's imagination.
Yeah.
As you say, those people that might not listen to the podcast and might not come to our sites or your restaurant.
So will we look out for you glued to a bridge in the near future then?
Glued to a cow, possibly.
Yeah, exactly. Chaps, thank you very much. That was a really fascinating conversation. And I think the key is that we all have to do our bit and then try and put pressure on the bigger organisations to do their bit, which amazing organisations are doing, like the Real Junk Food Project, and obviously on a smaller level like what you guys are doing as well. So Eddie and Will, thank you very much for being here. By the way, the population now, so in half an hour of us chatting, 7,890,395,899, which is 5,000 more than when we started.
Wow.
Just in that short amount of time. So there you go. It's a lot of mouths to feed.
Crazy.
Chaps, thank you very much. Appreciate
Pleasure.
that.
Thank you.
Cheers.
That's it from us then on LIFICAST episode 2. Do join us again next time.